Todo dia é uma oportunidade de mostrar quem somos, de se superar, de fazer o melhor. Em cada dia que começa, a gente vai construindo juntos o nosso jeito de ser, de aprender, de educar. A gente vai construindo juntos o UniBrasil.
A UniBrasil, por mais que tenha crescido, que tenha ampliado sua estrutura, o número de pessoas, a UniBrasil não se desviou do seu foco inicial, que é o principal, é a qualidade de ensino, do processo de ensino-aprendizagem. É acreditar no mérito acadêmico, acreditar no potencial dos alunos, no potencial dos professores, acreditar que as pessoas podem realmente fazer a transformação.
O professor aqui não é melhor do que o aluno. O professor aqui é o profissional que se formou antes e que já tem mais experiência e que agora passa por um processo de ser o facilitador do processo de aprendizagem, né? Então o aluno vai encontrar, eu acho, muito mais portas abertas do que barreiras a serem superadas.
E eu passava na frente do UniBrasil todo dia para ir e voltar da escola. E aí eu olhava no portão e imaginava assim, um dia eu ainda vou estudar aqui. Eu sentia isso.
O jovem de hoje, ele é um jovem que ele inova, que ele empreende, que ele se relaciona. Então, o espírito do UniBrasil tem a ver com isso.
Somos assim.
Somos assim.
Somos assim.
Somos assim.
Somos assim.
Somos assim.
Só um pouquinho. Já posso? Só um segundo. Albert. Ele já é muito conhecido entre nós e tem diversos amigos aqui no Brasil, também em Curitiba. Já esteve aqui por diversas vezes. Em Curitiba já teve a oportunidade de estar aqui 3 ou 4 vezes. Mas para aqueles que estão aqui pela primeira vez, tendo contato com uma palestra do professor Richard Albert, eu faço uma breve apresentação dele. O professor Richard Albert é William Stamps Farish Professor in Law, Professor of Government e diretor de estudos constitucionais na Universidade do Texas, no Austin. Nasceu e cresceu no Canadá, onde trabalhou também como Law Clerk para o Presidente da Suprema Corte do Canadá. Ele publicou mais de 20 livros, incluindo um dos mais recentes, Constitutional Amendments, publicado pela Oxford University, em 2019. Suas publicações têm sido traduzidas para diversas línguas, russo, chinês, húngaro, espanhol e também para o português. Hoje, o professor Richard Albert vai falar para nós sobre Constitutional Amendments, emendas constitucionais. Como debatedores, nós teremos aqui os professores Bruno Menezes Lorenzetto, nosso coordenador do PPGD, e o professor William Soares Pugliese. Quero agradecer ao professor Bruno no auxílio a essa coordenação e também aos doutorandos Isadora Teixeira e Luiz Carlos Gisler pela organização do evento. Também quero agradecer e introduzir vocês o professor Richard Albert. Hi, Richard. How are you? It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here. Feel yourself at home with us. Our students are very excited to hear you speaking about constitutional amendments. And first of all, I want to thank you very much accepting this invitation. As I told you before, our Constitution is very young compared to yours, but has received more than 100 amendments. And now some people feel, to be honest, wants to make a new Constitution. And that for us is very serious. So I think you have to debate this. And I'm reading your book, these books I said before, and you said there that constitutional amendments rules are the gatekeepers to a constitution. So I think in Brazil, our gates came down, or we lost this important sense of gates. And we have to discuss it, as I said, and no one better than you now to talk with us about this issue. So feel at home, and thank you once again, Richard.
Well, thank you very much. This is such an honor for me to have the chance to be with you today. And it's a unique time here in the United States because it's in the midst of a holiday period. Yesterday was Thanksgiving. And in the United States, Americans gather and with families and friends to celebrate this tradition, this holiday, and to give thanks for everything that they have in their lives. And so for me, it's appropriate to say, even though I'm Canadian, not American, it's appropriate for me to celebrate the holiday, but also to say thank you. I want to give thanks to you for this invitation. You know, we have such a marvelous community of scholars around the world, and we're in touch in person and online. And it's just a wonderful opportunity that you've given me, a real gift that you've given me to come and to see you and to exchange ideas with you at a very important time in the life of the great country of Brazil. And I say it's a great country because I know it well. I have been to Brazil many times. I have been to Sao Paulo. I've been to Curitiba. I've been to Brasilia. But you know, of all of my trips to Brazil, I've been to Curitiba the most, about 3 or 4 times. And I've been, of course, to UniBrasil. And it was a wonderful experience to be there with your colleagues and your students. And so thank you for this wonderful invitation to come back to meet you virtually until we can meet in person again sometime around in the world. If I could, Professor, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if it works. Do you see one screen? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm going to begin maybe just where the professor just left off in his introductory remarks, which is about the making and changing of constitutions. And I think that a constitution and the rules for how we amend the constitution are vital, essential parts to a constitution. They are like a lock and key. One cannot work without the other. And so if you look around the constitutions of the world, you'll see that about 96% of all of the world's constitutions have rules to amend that constitution. It's no surprise, because I think they're indispensable parts to a constitution. But if you also think more clearly and broadly about what we all know collectively about the rules of amendment, I think it's very little. We know very little about the rules of amendment as a matter of theory and as a matter of comparative constitutional studies. And so what I've done in some writings, including a number of books and papers, is I've tried to illustrate not only the importance of amendment rules, but also how they work, how they're designed, and also what their functions are and what their limitations are. And so these are some of the questions that interest me and that I hope will interest you over the course of the next 25 or 30 minutes or so as I address some of these questions that I've been invited to discuss. And so the subject of my remarks, the title, is Constitutional Amendment and Dismemberment. Constitutional Amendment and Dismemberment. But first, I want to say once again, thank you. I want to say thank you for this generous invitation that I received from Professor Octavio Campos Fischer, with whom I've been in touch for the past little while, and it's a pleasure really to be your guest today. I also want to thank Drs. Bruno and William for offering comments after my remarks. It's really a pleasure that I look forward to There's no greater opportunity than to have someone read your work and to think about it and then give some reactions to it. And so I want to thank you in advance for the comments that you make. And also I want to recognize one of the founders of your great institution, UniBrasil. I want to recognize Professor Clemerson Cleve, who is, I think, a great scholar, a giant scholar of the Constitution and of constitutionalism. Perhaps you know, or maybe you don't know, that I organized a recent contest to try to identify the most important book in modern constitutionalism. And we had 200 books nominated for this honor from around the world. And then we had a contest to determine which is the best book. And Professor Cleve's book was in that tournament, and he advanced to the quarterfinals. And so that, I think, is a testament not only to the great scholar that he is, but also more generally to the great leadership that he has shown by creating this wonderful institution that you are all a part of. So thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to begin in Brazil. I want to go to the year 2016. That's when the Constitution of Brazil was amended to insert the public spending cap amendment. You may know that this amendment limits public spending for up to 20 years. And the purpose of the amendment, as you will recall, was to limit expenditures on health and education, in addition to other areas of public life, in order to address the country's increasing budget gap. Here's the problem. It might be a good idea to try to attack the debt and the deficit in this way. But here's the problem. The problem is that this amendment conflicts with the Constitution's commitment to the social state. There's a preamble in your Constitution that commits the state to ensuring the exercise of social rights. And the Constitution identifies social values as one of its fundamental principles. And it declares that one of its foremost objectives is to eradicate poverty and substandard living conditions and to reduce social and regional inequalities. You also see, of course you know this, that the Constitution makes a certain menu of rights unamendable. And now today, social rights are also unamendable as a result of the Supreme Court's interpretation. And so what we have when we look at the Constitution of Brazil is a set of rules that protects social rights, including the right to public health care, to social assistance, and to education. Workers also have a special catalog of rights, rights to minimum wages, unemployment insurance, and wage reduction protection. Unlike the rest of the Constitution that has undergone about 100 amendments since 1988, the protections for social rights have not once been altered until this public spending cap amendment in 2016. Now, I think, like I said, the purpose of this public spending cap amendment is a good one, to control spending, but it conflicts directly with the commitment to social values and to the social state that the Constitution of Brazil makes. And so this was an amendment, proposed as an amendment, ratified as an amendment, and today people treat it as an amendment. What I want to suggest to you, by beginning here in Brazil and then walking you around the rest of the world with other examples, is that this amendment, like many others that we see around the world, is not just an amendment. It's something more than an amendment. It's a big transformative change to the Constitution that we should not understand as a simple amendment. We need to understand it in a different way because its effect is dramatic. Come now with me from Brazil to Albania. In 2015, I was invited to assist the Constitutional Reform Committee of Albania, assist them in designing a series of constitutional amendments to their constitution. The objective was to refashion the Constitution to assist in the eventual accession to the European Union. What was eventually proposed to amend the Albanian Constitution was a package of amendments that did a number of dramatic things. It created a constitutional court. It created a high judicial council. It created a special anti-corruption force. It curtailed legislative powers, and it included a new declaration of constitutional values. This was a huge package of constitutional changes, and this package was made as a simple amendment to the Constitution of Albania. A huge transformation to the Constitution. I want to suggest to you, in the time that I have, that the amendment package in Albania is very similar to the amendment that we saw in Brazil in 2016, and that is very similar to the other kinds of amendments we see around the world. What do they have in common? They're more than simple amendments, much more than simple amendments. Come now with me to the Caribbean, where in 2016, the Constitution of Grenada was amended, or at least it was an effort to amend it, because Grenada has long been on a path toward constitutional reform. The country has long wanted to do a number of things, like to end appeals to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in England, to accede to the appellate jurisdiction of the Caribbean Court of Justice, to entrench rights and freedoms in the Constitution, to create rules on elections, to set term limits for the Prime Minister, to create fixed election dates. All of these proposals were introduced as an amendment to the Constitution of Grenada, and they were proposed to the people in a referendum. Now, every single proposal failed in the referendum, but that's not the point. The point is that all of these changes, momentous changes, enormous changes, were proposed as simple amendments to the Constitution of Grenada. They failed, but they would have dramatically transformed the Constitution. This amendment, like the one in Brazil, like the one in Albania, more than a simple amendment. It's much, much more. Just as we saw in Italy in 2016. There, a reform was proposed that would have changed the powers of the Senate and of the regions. It would have altered the separation of powers. It would have changed the confidence relationship between the government and the parliament. This particular amendment package would have changed 30% of the Constitution of Italy. It was presented as an amendment. It was proposed as an amendment, but it would have transformed the entire Constitution of Italy. So again, like in Brazil, like in Albania, like in Grenada, this amendment proposal was much more than a simple amendment proposal. It would have really changed the entirety of the Constitution, so we should not call it a simple amendment. We saw something very similar in Turkey just 3 years ago. The Constitution was transformed from a parliamentary system to a presidential system. And this new presidential system gave virtually unlimited powers to the president. This is a big change because prior to the presidential system, there was a parliamentary system of lawmaking and decision-making. The same package of changes that introduced this new super presidential system also reduced the number of constitutional court judges. There were tens of alterations to the Constitution of Turkey as a result of this package of amendment that was approved by the people. And yet, it was more than an amendment. It was a huge transformation of the Constitution. Like the change in Brazil, in Albania, in Grenada, in Italy, it was called an amendment, but it was something much more than that. We saw examples in Ireland as well in 2013, where there was a proposal to abolish the Senate. And that would have changed the very nature of democracy in Ireland. Again, not a simple amendment, even though it was called an amendment and understood as an amendment. Last example, come now with me to Asia, to Japan, where there is an article, Article 9, that commits the state to pacifism. Pacifism. And yet, there were efforts in 2014, still all the way to today, to amend away the state's commitment to pacifism, a commitment to pacifism that was put in the post-war Constitution of 1946. This change to the Constitution would be a transformation, just like the public spending cap amendment was a transformation of the Brazilian Constitution, just like removing the Senate from Ireland would transform the Constitution of Ireland. And so you see, what I'm trying to paint for you is a portrait of what we see happening around the world, not only in Brazil, not only in Albania, not only in Japan, Italy, but really in virtually every single region of the world. We see efforts to change the Constitution using the simple rules of amendment to make a change to the Constitution that is a dramatic transformation. That, I think, is inappropriate. One way to understand all of these changes that I've been discussing with you so far, changes in Brazil and Albania and Grenada and Turkey and Ireland and Italy and Japan, one way to think of these changes is to think of an apple and think of removing the core of the apple from that apple. The apple survives, but it becomes unlike what it was prior to the core being removed. Now, in some cases, the ones that I've described to you just a moment ago, in some cases, the changes were successful. In others, they were not. But the point is that all of these examples of amendments were reforms that were presented to the people as amendments, and they would have been formalized using the rules of amendment. But I think we need a different term. We need a different concept. We need a different way to understand the magnitude of the changes that were made to the Constitution of Brazil, proposed to be made to the constitutions of Italy and Ireland, that were made in Turkey, that were made in Albania. We need a different concept, because the concept of amendment doesn't quite capture the dramatic, enormous nature of the changes that are made to the Constitution. And so the question presents itself. If all of these changes, if all of them were something other than an amendment, what should we call them? What should we understand them as, if not amendments? Another way to think about it is to think about it in terms of a constitutional transformation. All of these changes that I've described to you really reconstructed the Constitution, reconstructed the Constitution of Brazil, reconstructed the Constitution of Turkey, reconstructed the Constitution of Albania. And yet we call these changes amendments, despite the fact that they dismantle a core component of the Constitution, despite the fact that they effectively deconstruct and then reconstruct a fundamental feature of the Constitution. These changes are substantial, and they entail substantial consequences for all of law and all of society in the jurisdiction where they are made. And so the question, what are these changes if not constitutional amendments? Let me just recap the ground that we've covered so far. We have seen around the world that there are major constitutional changes that have happened and that are happening today. They're called amendments, they're passed as amendments, and I'm suggesting to you that they are not in fact amendments, that they're something else. And so at this point, you would be right to ask yourselves, well, if these changes aren't amendments, then what is an amendment? What do we speak of? We speak of amendments, if not these changes that were made in Brazil, in Turkey, in Albania. What is an amendment? Well, I'll tell you what an amendment is. An amendment, properly understood, is defined by four fundamental features: its subject, its authority, its scope, and its purpose. So an amendment is an authoritative change to the higher law. And that change can correct, it can elaborate, it can reform, it can restore the meaning of the Constitution consistent with the Constitution's existing framework and fundamental presuppositions. Sometimes amendments are approved using special procedures and sometimes not. But the point is that an amendment has one overriding feature that matters more than all others. And that's the scope of the change. That's the third feature here on this list. The amended Constitution must remain coherent, must remain consistent with the pre-amendment Constitution. And so an amendment, properly understood, continues the Constitution-making project in line with the existing design of the Constitution. When you amend the Constitution, that entails unbroken unity with the Constitution that's being amended. And so you can think of an amendment as a change that improves on the Constitution's design where necessary or where useful to better align expectations about how the Constitution should function with the reality of how the Constitution does function. And so an amendment fixes the Constitution's design flaws when those flaws are discovered. But an amendment, and this is the key point, an amendment does not push the boundaries of the Constitution any further than the Constitution's outermost limits. I'm going to give you some examples now of changes that are actually well and properly understood as amendments. And to do that, I'll tell you about 4 different purposes that amendments can have. 4 distinct purposes. An amendment can be corrective, it can be elaborative, it can be reformative, and it can be restorative. And I'm going to give you an example of each. Each of these will be highlighted by one example of what is a true amendment, and I'll draw from the United States Constitution to give you some illustrations. First, an amendment can be corrective. It can make a correction to the design of a Constitution. And here, let's think of the 12th Amendment to the US Constitution. The 12th Amendment is a corrective amendment. And to understand why, we have to go back to the founding design of the US Constitution in 1787. Because there, as you may know, the Constitution required each presidential elector to cast 2 votes for president. And the person who got the most votes for president became president. And the person who got the second most votes for president became vice president. Now, the election of 1800 exposed the design flaw in this selection mechanism. Why? Well, because 2 candidates got the precise number of votes, same number of votes for president. There was a tie. And so it took about 36 different ballots in the House of Representatives to ultimately break this tie. That's not how you want to run an election, is to have a tie that is then decided, or broken rather, in the House of Representatives in 36 rounds of voting. No, the president should be elected in the process that is designed for the people to choose either directly or indirectly. That's not what happened in 1800. And so as a result, political actors in the United States said, we have to fix this problem. There cannot be a tie for who becomes president. And so the 12th Amendment requires electors now to cast ballots for president and then different ballots for vice president. That reduces the possibility of a tie ever happening. That's an example of a corrective amendment. Now, what about an elaborative amendment? Well, the 19th Amendment is an example of an elaboration, because an amendment, remember, I can say has 4 purposes. This is the second purpose, elaboration. Like a correction, an elaboration continues the Constitution-making project in line with the current design of the Constitution. But instead of correcting an error or a flaw in the Constitution, which is what a corrective amendment does, instead of that, an elaboration advances the meaning of the Constitution as it is presently understood. The example that I want to give you is the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment advances the meaning of the 14th Amendment, which codifies the Equal Protection Clause. And it builds on the 15th Amendment's protection of the right to vote without regard to race. And so the 19th Amendment doesn't correct an error in the Constitution. It elaborates the meaning of equality in the Constitution by giving women the right to vote without infringement by any state actor. That's an elaboration of the Constitution. That's the second kind of amendment that I want to show you today. Third, an amendment can be corrective, can be elaborative. It can also be reformative. And this is the third example that I want to show you. A reformative amendment revises an existing rule in the Constitution, but does not undermine the Constitution's core principles. So, for example, it can change the operation of a feature in the Constitution, but in a non-transformative way. For example, the 20th Amendment. The 20th Amendment reforms the US Constitution in a non-transformative way. How? By reducing the period of time between the date of the presidential election and the date of the president's inauguration. And it reduces that period of time by 2 months. Because originally, the president became president on March 4th. The 20th Amendment changes that, and it says the president becomes president on January 20th. This is a reform to the Constitution. It's not a big transformative change. It keeps the Constitution coherent and consistent. The last example I'd like to give you of an amendment is a restorative amendment. You've heard about a corrective amendment, an elaborative amendment, a reformative amendment. This now is a restorative amendment. And the example here is the 22nd Amendment. A restorative amendment returns the Constitution to its earlier meaning, an earlier meaning that lawmakers believe has been lost or eroded. The 22nd Amendment is an example of a restorative amendment, and its origins date to the United States' first president, George Washington. He refused to run for a third term, even though he could have kept running and winning indefinitely. And his successors followed that same pattern. They followed that example. They chose not to run for 3 terms until this person you see before you, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He broke that 2-term tradition in the Second World War on the argument that the country needed steady leadership during this unprecedented moment of crisis. So he ended up being elected 4 times for president, breaking the 2-term tradition created by George Washington. But shortly after the death of President Roosevelt, the US approved the 22nd Amendment that limited presidents to no more than 2 terms. This amendment restores the earlier meaning of the US Constitution that says you cannot run for more than 2 terms. And so what we've seen then is that amendments can be corrective, they can be elaborative, they can be reformative, they can be restorative. The key in all cases, all 4 of these cases, is that the amendment must cohere with the existing Constitution and must keep the Constitution consistent with its pre-change form. Otherwise, the change is much more than an amendment. Okay, now, what about the changes in Brazil, in Ireland, in Italy, in Albania, in Turkey, in Japan, in Grenada? Those changes were called amendments to the Constitution. They were proposed as amendments. They were understood as amendments. But I've told you that they were not, in fact, amendments. And so the question presents itself, finally. What are those changes, if not amendments? What should we call them? How should we understand them if they are not amendments? They are a constitutional dismemberment. Each of them is a constitutional dismemberment. A constitutional dismemberment removes the core from the Constitution. It transforms the Constitution in a significant way. A constitutional dismemberment does violence to the existing Constitution because it destroys one of its essential features. Now, a constitutional dismemberment can occur suddenly in a big bang moment or gradually by erosion or by accretion. It can occur to constitutions that are both codified and uncodified, and it can either enhance or deteriorate liberal democracy. These changes, these constitutional dismemberments, they're often done using the rules of amendment, and they're commonly described as constitutional amendments. The point, however, is that they are not amendments. They are amendments in name alone. You can think of a constitutional amendment as entailing 4 specific characteristics, and this is what distinguishes them from a constitutional amendment. First, a constitutional dismemberment is incompatible with the existing framework of the Constitution. That's why the Public Cap Spending Amendment is not in fact an amendment. It's a dismemberment. It is incompatible with the Brazilian Constitution's commitment to a social state. Second, dismemberment seeks to achieve a conflicting purpose and to disassemble one or more of the Constitution's core parts. You see, A dismemberment entails a fundamental transformation of one or more of the country's constitutional commitments. Third, a constitutional dismemberment alters the identity, the fundamental rights, or the basic structure of the Constitution. It intends deliberately to destroy one or more of the Constitution's elemental parts. Now, an amendment does not go that far because, properly defined, a constitutional amendment keeps the altered Constitution coherent with its pre-change identity, pre-change rights, pre-change structure. And so we can use a rough shorthand here if you like. The shorthand is that the purpose of a dismemberment is to unmake the Constitution. Last point. The last point is one that you may have observed on your own in light of the many different examples that I've raised so far, but it's critical. This fourth point is critical. A constitutional dismemberment is a descriptive idea, not a normative idea. It can either improve or weaken liberal democratic procedures and outcomes. And so, for example, the American Reconstruction in defense of liberal democratic values, that was a dismemberment. But so too is the transformation today of the Hungarian constitution from a liberal state to an illiberal one. So these are the four fundamental features of a constitutional dismemberment, four features that allow us to distinguish a dismemberment from an amendment. Now, we've encountered many examples so far of constitutional dismemberments. I want to give you one more example, but this time I'm going to draw from the United States. And I want to turn the clock back to the year 1860 in the midst of the US presidential election. Abraham Lincoln, the person you see now before you, was running for president as a candidate and then as president in his inaugural address. Abraham Lincoln supported the ratification of a controversial amendment proposal. Here is the text of the proposal. No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. The text of this amendment was drafted shrewdly, cleverly, to hide its purpose in plain sight, like much of the rest of the Constitution that embeds slavery deep within its architecture, but does not dare speak its name. Because you see, this amendment, when referring to domestic institutions, that's a reference to the institution of slavery. And so what this amendment does, you see, that it offers an enticing carrot to the slave states. The promise is that they would say, we're going to stay in the Union. We promise to do that. But in return, Congress has to promise never to interfere with this profitable but evil practice of slavery. This amendment proposal was part of a larger effort to prevent the South from seceding from the Union. And Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, approved this amendment, supported this amendment, campaigned on this amendment. Lincoln was not alone. Many other people have supported this amendment, including his predecessor as president, James Buchanan, along with 2/3 of the Congress, both houses, because they approved this amendment proposal. And then the legislatures of Maryland approved, Ohio approved, and Illinois approved. This amendment was on its way to ratification, on its way to becoming the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. This amendment that says you can forever practice the evil institution of slavery. This could have become part of the US Constitution. It was on its way to ratification. But then the Civil War broke out, and the Civil War interrupted the march to ratification. And in one of the great redemptive twists in the history of America, there is today, instead of this 13th Amendment, that makes slavery lawful and a permanent feature of the Constitution. Instead, what you have is a 13th Amendment today that actually does the opposite, that abolishes slavery and makes it unlawful for anyone to engage in. I want to recap now, if I could, what we've covered so far. We have these two 13th Amendments. You have one 13th Amendment that failed and one that was successful. The one that failed, the one that Abraham Lincoln supported at first, would have made slavery legal and permanent. The one that succeeded did the opposite, made slavery illegal and ended the practice. These two 13th Amendments confront us with the question, what is an amendment? Which of these two is an amendment and which of these two is a dismemberment? Because only one of these was an amendment and only one was a dismemberment. And so remember the definitions of an amendment and of a dismemberment. An amendment must be a change that continues the Constitution-making project in line with the existing meaning and architecture of the Constitution. In contrast, a dismemberment does violence to the existing Constitution, changes the course of the Constitution, erodes one of its fundamental pillars. So which of these two amendment proposals was in fact an amendment? Which of these two was instead a dismemberment? Well, the amendment proposal to make slavery lawful forever and a permanent feature of the US Constitution, that was an amendment, because the existing design of the Constitution really put slavery at the core of the Constitution. The state of the Senate is rooted in slavery. The rule that each state must have 2 senators is rooted in slavery. The Electoral College is rooted in slavery. The protections for federalism are rooted in slavery. There are many other features of the US Constitution as originally designed that reflect the country's commitment to permitting slavery to continue. And so the original 13th Amendment is properly called an amendment. In contrast, the actual 13th Amendment, the one that passed, the one that abolishes slavery, that is a dismemberment because it destroys the Constitution's commitment to slavery. It really eradicates the major pillars of the infrastructure that kept slavery going in the United States. So that's the idea of a constitutional dismemberment. There are a number of proposals that follow from the idea of a dismemberment, and this leads me to just 2 final points that I want to make, if I could. Just 2 final points. I want to make 1 point about constitutional theory and 1 point about constitutional design. So let's begin with theory. I would like to situate for you the concept of constitutional dismemberment within the scope of our current knowledge about constitutional amendment theory, okay? The conventional theory of constitutional change generates what I think is a very unhelpful binary classification. And here is the binary classification that you see before you. Either a constitutional change amends the Constitution, or it results in a new Constitution, whether or not a new Constitution is promulgated. Consider an example raised by John Rawls, the great constitutional theorist. He asks a question in his book, Political Liberalism. Would a constitutional amendment that repeals the First Amendment to the US Constitution, would that be a valid use of the rules of amendment in Article 5? Rawls says no, because Rawls says that if you use Article 5 to repeal the First Amendment, you would be creating a new Constitution. You couldn't call it an amendment. You would have to call it a new Constitution because it's just too big to be called a new amendment. And this view of constitutional theory, you see, reflects the conventional understanding of how constitutions change. A change is either an amendment or it's a new constitution, even though no new constitution has been promulgated. This is a view that is echoed by Walter Murphy, by Carl Schmitt, by scholars in the field of constitutional theory, but I think this is incorrect. I think is incorrect because there's a better way, I think, of understanding how constitutions change. What you see before you is a third category between new constitution and constitutional amendment. That is where we place the idea of a constitutional dismemberment. It's not a new constitution, but nor is it a constitutional amendment, you see. It's a bigger kind of a change than an amendment, but it's not quite the promulgation of a new constitution. And so we have to think about it differently. We have to think about constitutional theory and the conventional understanding of constitutional change to account for this concept of dismemberment, because as I've shown you with reference to Brazil, Japan, Italy, Ireland, Turkey, Albania, Grenada, the US, many examples around the world, there are changes that are made to constitutions that are more than an amendment and less than a new constitution. That's the first of two final points I want to make. The second point I want to make before I close doesn't involve constitutional theory. It involves constitutional design, how you actually build constitutions. And I think here the concept of a constitutional dismemberment is relevant to constitutional design, specifically in how we design the rules of constitutional amendment. The point is that when you design a constitution and its rules for amendment, you should have rules both for amendment and for dismemberment. What does that mean? That means that there should be procedures to make changes to the Constitution that are small in nature, and rules to change the Constitution in a way that is big. So we want to be able to make small changes, minor tinkering with the Constitution, housekeeping changes, but we also want to make permissible big changes to the Constitution. There aren't many constitutions today that do this, that codify procedures that allow political actors to make both big changes and small changes in a way that is reflected in the thresholds required to make those changes, because this is the key point. It's not enough to say that a constitution should be amendable to make small changes and big changes. That's not enough, because the key point is to say that small changes should be made using a lower threshold of agreement, and big changes should require a higher threshold of agreement from political actors and the people that they represent. That is the innovation here. That's the key point, is that a constitutional amendment procedure should have multiple procedures within it, but each one should have a different threshold of agreement needed to use it. And the threshold of agreement should rise and fall depending on the importance of the change. So if you're going to make a huge change to the Constitution, you can't just do that with a simple parliamentary majority. You need to have a lot of people agreeing. If it's a federal country, you need some of the states or the lender or the provinces to agree. Maybe you need a referendum. If it's a small change, you don't need the provinces, the states, the lender to agree. Just let the parliament do it. And now the question that you may be asking is, okay, well, how do we determine what is a small change and what is a big change? How do we know what is a small change? What is a big change? What requires a higher threshold of agreement? What requires a lower threshold of agreement? You might be asking, I think, quite rightly, how do we know? And the answer is the Constitution will tell us. Because when you design the Constitution, political actors who write the Constitution should put in the text what requires which threshold of change for amendment. So if you care about this particular rule or this particular procedure or this particular principle, you will say that it requires a higher threshold to change. If you don't care so much about it because you think that it could be changeable, should be changeable using a lower threshold, then you say that, and you make it susceptible to change using the lower level of change. This, I think, is a great innovation that we see around the world in some of the world's constitutions. Like, for example, the constitutions of Austria. of Ecuador, of Costa Rica, of Spain, of Switzerland, of Canada. But you see, there aren't many examples of constitutions like this, where they codify different rules for amendment and different rules for dismemberment. You don't have this in many of the world's constitutions, and yet I think this is necessary. This is, I think, an innovative design for constitutional amendment rules because it makes all changes possible. Here's one example to give you a specific illustration. Look at the Constitution of Costa Rica. This is the Constitution of Costa Rica from 1949 that's still in existence today. Look at this first rule in Article 195. This is one procedure to amend the Constitution. Look at the text. It authorizes what is called a partial reform. This is another way of calling a change an amendment, meaning a change that keeps the Constitution consistent and coherent with its pre-change self. Now, the second rule is quite interesting, you see, because it authorizes general reforms of the constitutions or total reforms. This is a procedure that allows for the dismemberment of the Constitution. But you see, it requires a higher threshold of agreement to make this change. So that's the distinction between amendment and dismemberment. That is the change. That is the distinction. Partial reforms, those require a lower threshold. General reforms require a higher threshold. And that maps onto the distinction between amendment and dismemberment that I've been explaining to you in the time that we've had together so far. Let me now close with just a few thoughts. Constitutional amendment is such an important part of constitutions and of constitutionalism because amendments have important democracy-enhancing virtues. They create a public, predictable, transparent way to express the preferences of lawmakers and the people that they represent. Amendment rules also give us a way to change the Constitution and to know when it's being changed, rather than it's being changed surreptitiously in informal ways that are becoming more and more prevalent today. Amendment procedures also invite civic engagement when they're invoked. And finally, when they're actually used successfully, they produce something that you can point to, a text, right? You can look to the text of the Constitution for codified constitutions and say, there is the result of this great mobilization of legislative and popular forces to change our basic bargain. And so for all of these reasons and more, amendment is a significant, central, essential part of a constitution, but also more generally of constitutionalism. Now, it's too bad, just as I close now with about 30 more seconds, it's too bad that amendment design is not a central preoccupation in the study of constitutions, nor is it a central preoccupation of those who write constitutions to begin with. And that's a problem, which is why I've really devoted a lot of my time to writing about amendment rules, not only in articles, but in books, to really illuminate for people the central significance of amendment rules, their theory, their history, their use, and their design. Because I think Edmund Burke was right. Edmund Burke was right when he insisted that a state without the means of some change is without the means of its own conservation. And so with that, I'm going to close. And I want to thank you once again for this fabulous invitation, Professor Octavio Campos Fischer, to join you at UniBrasil. And I look forward to comments from Dr. Bruno and Dr. William on these ideas that I've put on the table that I hope have been useful, interesting, and at the very least provocative for all of you. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Hi, Richard. Thank you very, very much. Your words and great lessons you gave us today, and were very provocative, very interesting. And I think that looking what some countries like Brazil are doing, that we must take amendment purpose or amendment power very seriously, because we see that a lot of amendments here to our Constitution don't respect what you said in the beginning, the framework of the Constitution, our Constitution. But before transmit the word to Professor William, I want to introduce you, Professor Bruno. Here, he's here. Bruno.
Hi, Richard. Sorry, I don't have the camera, but you don't need to introduce us, Otávio, because Richard has been already with us at the UniBrasil. I just don't remember if 2 or 3 years ago, and I gave him a ride. He met my daughter, so
yes.
And but I'd just like to thank Richard for his being with us again, and I'd like to invite him in the next opportunity when we pass what is happening here in the world to come to Brazil, and so we can talk with him and we can have another ways of discussing these. But
I would like that very much, and it's such a pleasure to be in touch with you again, because you were such a great host. You cannot see, but I have another computer right here, and I have a photo that I took of UniBrasil right here.
Wow,
I don't know if you can see, but
that's it. It's a proof that you have been.
Yeah.
Our campus.
So I took this photo when I came to campus, and you were so generous, and I had such a lovely time. And I look forward to coming back to Curitiba, because there's so much to do there, so much to see there, but also so much good food. I remember the churrascaria.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I sat down at the table, and I was 170 pounds. And then when I finished my meal, I was 175.
Yes, that's the picture.
Yes, thank you, Richard. And sorry for my technical problems today. And thank you for the lecture. It's always an honor. I believe you are the person that has the biggest knowledge about constitutional amendments in the world, because you did such a great job, and with so many different countries and so different perspectives. And I'm happy to see that you have developed your theory from during these years, and so it's really good. And I believe that's mandatory that anyone that is studying this subject reads your texts, because you have become possibly the person in the world that knows the most. And for us, is really an honor receiving you.
Well, thank you very much. And just I should say one more thing, which is that as I was building this theory, I presented the initial ideas at UniBrasil. And so the comments that I got from faculty and students were really central to helping me design the contours of the theory. And so this really is a theory that is a result of great comments and help from colleagues around the world, but especially from my colleagues and friends at UniBrasil. So thank you very, very much.
Yes, I believe you are a really good example of someone that's doing a serious job in comparative constitutional law. And I also like to say that your work related to ICON is really important. So because you have like many young constitutionalists from different places, and it's really important. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So, thank you, Bruno. Thank you for being with us. You have some difficulties, and it's really thanks to get with us here. But now, Professor William, you have the word if you want to do some comments.
Thank you, Professor Otávio. I also like to greet Professor Bruno, who we cannot see, but is always with us. And most importantly, I'd like to thank Professor Richard for being here with us, and especially because he is here with us during national holidays in the US. So although we in Brazil do not exactly celebrate Thanksgiving, consider that we at UniBrasil are actually celebrating Thanksgiving because we are here with you. So I think I say this in name of everyone from faculty and from students, and that we are really, really thankful for having you here with us once more. And I hope that the next time you can come in person so we can talk about constitutional amendments or any other subject, and then we can go gain a few pounds somewhere here in Curitiba. And well, I have the very hard task of being a commentator, or my task is to present a few questions, if possible. I do have a few questions that were sent by YouTube from colleagues. I'd like to present one or two questions from my own, with one single and very short comment that I would also like to thank you for that. When we try to think about law, usually we try to make law as rigid and as strictly as possible. Law is always related to safety, to probability, to predictability. And hearing your lecture, once more, I realized that the most important aspects in law are actually the aspects of change, the aspects of transformation, amendment, dismemberment, and these topics are the hardest ones, and therefore they are the topics that most scholars do not face, do not engage. And for me, that is one of the reasons why your work is and should be studied all around the world. I mean, thinking about constitutional change or constitutional amendment, constitutional dismemberment, is not something that is not a theme that we only think about when there is an amendment. And I know in the US, in Canada, that's not something that is so common. In Brazil, it is almost monthly. We do have an amendment, but we are thinking about change. And to me, your example about the slavery amendment is really, it really purports this statement, because we have to think about change. And regarding this subject, I would like to ask you two very brief questions, but I'd like to know what Professor Richard has to say about this. When you showed us the picture of the apple and you spoke about the constitutional core, I would like to know if there is some kind of constitutional core which would not be subject to change. I mean, can I believe, we do have examples that say, like in Brazil, we do have some clauses in our constitution that are not subject to change, but is it a good decision? Should we have this? Or considering the dismemberment theory, is it too much to ask? I mean, can we really believe in a few clauses that cannot be amended or dismembered? Is there a constitutional core in this sense? And the other question is, if we don't have this specific procedure for a constitutional dismemberment, should we consider changing this part of the Constitution or any Constitution to face this kind of situation? Or should we leave this to, let's say, a constitutional court or to Congress to consider that this is a dismemberment and not an amendment? So those are the two questions. I hope I have been clear on my English, and thank you once again for the amazing attention and the amazing lecture of today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. It's such a pleasure to engage in conversation with you about these fascinating subjects. And I want to thank you for thinking so thoughtfully and clearly about the ideas that I presented and asking me these two very challenging questions, because I think you put your finger on really difficult questions. And that is, of course, the task of a commentator. And so congratulations. You've made my job a lot harder, but it's okay. It's okay, because we're engaged in a collaborative enterprise to arrive at the right answers. And so that's how I take your questions. And once again, thank you. You've asked two questions. One is about unamendability. And I think I understand the question as asking, and I'm going to restate it for the students in the group, as asking whether unamendability is a good idea or whether unamendability is a bad idea. Because of course, the Constitution of Brazil makes many things unamendable. Federalism, civil and political rights. You have many things that are made formally unamendable. But not only that, I believe the STF has interpreted social rights as also being unamendable. And so you see there's a growing number of items that fall under the purview of the things that are codified as unamendable, which is quite interesting. And then the second question, if I can restate it for your students here, is Article 60 of the Brazilian Constitution codifies the rules of change. But the rules of change do not recognize amendment procedures versus dismemberment procedures. So should it be changed to allow procedures both for amendment on the one hand and for dismemberment on the other? Or is it better to have what you have, which is an all-inclusive, comprehensive procedure to amend the Constitution? Okay, difficult questions. On unamendability, I know that the STF has enforced the unamendable provisions on many occasions in its judgments. I've been reading about this recently, and I have a list of the cases that the STF has issued about this, because there have been arguments, as you know, that certain amendments have violated the unamendable rules in the Constitution. And so I know that in ADIs number 829 and 830 and 833, the STF used this power to overturn amendments on the basis of the separation of powers. And I know also that in ADI 3685, the STF disapplied an amendment from 2006 to the general elections. And I know that in ADI number 939, the STF invalidated an amendment in regard to tax immunity and reciprocity. So you see, there's a wide range of instances in which the STF has exercised the power to invalidate amendments. But I want to distinguish the power of the STF to invalidate amendments, distinguish that from whether it's a good idea to have unamendable rules in the Constitution. Because when you have them in the Constitution, they have to be enforced in some way, right? They have to, they have some effect, unless you believe that they're in the Constitution just for an expressive purpose, just to say, we value this, but then you can go ahead and trample on those things. I don't think that's what the constitutional designers intended to do. When they put something in the Constitution that is unamendable, that require some action from someone. It doesn't have to be the courts. So in Norway, for example, in Switzerland, for example, there are unamendable rules, but it's not the courts that enforce them. It's the legislature that enforces them. Just so happens that in Brazil, it's the STF that enforces these unamendable rules. So the first point is that when a constitutional designer puts in the constitutional text unamendable rules, unless they mean for those rules to be just expressive, they have to be enforced, they have to be given bite. And it can be by the courts, it can be by the legislature, but someone has to do it. And in Brazil, it's the STF, and it has done so. I don't want to critique the STF for doing that because that's just what it does. If you want to talk about a critique, we can talk about the critique in a moment, but I just want to be clear that I want to distinguish those two questions. What do you do when they're in the Constitution versus should they be in the Constitution at all? So when they're in the Constitution, something has to be done with them, unless you believe they just have an expressive function. Now, the question, should you make anything unamendable in the first place? Should you put in your Constitution rules that say you cannot amend this or that or the other? My answer, no. You should not have unamendable rules in a Constitution. You should not. You should not have unamendable rules in a Constitution. I have many reasons why. Let me give you a couple. One is look at the world's unamendable rules and the differences among them. Let me just give you two examples. The Constitution of Turkey has many unamendable rules. One of them says the following: the flag shall be unamendable. Okay? The Turkish flag is unamendable. So if you as a political actor propose an amendment to change the flag of Turkey, we'll know when you're violating the rule because you're going to say, here is a green flag. But wait, the Turkish flag is not green, so unamendable. It's an unconstitutional effort to change the colors of the flag, period. But now, what about the Czech Republic? The Czech Republic also has unamendable rules. One of those rules is the following: that the essential characteristics of democracy are unamendable. Democracy is unamendable. What does democracy mean? What does democracy require? Is it just free and fair elections? Is it just elections? Is it political plurality? Is it gender parity? Is it fixed election terms? I mean, what is it? And so you see there's a difference in the two rules, right? It's very easy to figure out what is a violation of the unamendable rule on the flag. Very hard to figure out what is a violation of the unamendable rule on democracy. And so I'm worried about who gets to interpret what the unamendable rule means when it's written in such broad language. Imagine an unamendable rule that says constitutionalism is unamendable. What does that mean? That can mean so much. It can mean everything, it can mean nothing. And so if you do put something in the Constitution as unamendable, it's got to be specific. But I'd rather not have anything unamendable in the Constitution at all because of this problem of interpretation. There might be a difference between what was intended to be unamendable and what is enforced as unamendable. And I worry about putting too much power in the hands of those who determine what is unamendable when it's being interpreted. What's an alternative, you might ask, Professor William? If you don't have unamendable rules, but you want to protect certain things, how do you do it? How do you protect things that you really care about without making anything unamendable? Here's the answer. You create an escalating structure of amendment that has amendment rules of varying difficulty. So you have one procedure that is very easy to use for things that you care about, but not too much. You have a second procedure that is harder to use for things that are more important. You have a third procedure for the most important things, and you make those very hard to change. Never unamendable, never ever unamendable, but just hard to change, so that it's always at least theoretically possible to make a change. Don't take away the right of the people to change their own constitution by making something unamendable. That, I think, is a problem. So that's the first answer to my question is there's a difference in how unamendable rules are written, and that is a problem to me. We want to make them more specific if you make them at all. If you want an alternative to unamendability, use an escalating structure of amendment. We see this in South Africa, we see this in Canada, we see this in India, we see this in many countries of the world, where nothing is made unamendable, but things are made very hard to amend. It's also very easy to amend. It depends on what we're talking about. So for example, in Canada, if you want to amend the simple rules of parliamentary procedure, you use a simple amendment procedure that is very easy to pass because it requires the agreement of both houses of the parliament. That's it. But if you want to change the nature of and the composition of the Supreme Court, or you want to change Canada's relationship to the monarchy, two of the most important features of the Canadian Constitution, you need to use the hardest procedure, which is unanimous agreement. Parliament has to agree, and all of the 10 provinces have to agree. Very hard to do. The second reason why I think, Professor William, that unamendability is a bad idea is because when you make something unamendable in the Constitution, you're transforming the Constitution into something that is not a Constitution at all. A Constitution is supposed to be, in my view, a living charter of rules that evolves over time, that reflects the present wishes and values of the people. When you make something unamendable, you're freezing time. You're saying this will not change forever and ever. That's a problem, because that changes a constitution from a constitution into handcuffs. You're handcuffing people into living under circumstances and values that may not reflect what they truly believe in the present moment. So I believe instead that we should have escalating structures of amendment, make things very hard to change, not impossible, and allow change by amendment to the Constitution so that the Constitution reflects the current values and views of the people, not the views of those who wrote a constitution many generations ago. In Brazil, your constitution was written 32 years ago. That's over a generation. I'm not saying that it should be replaced. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, though, the older it gets, the more you might ask yourself whether things that are made unamendable still reflect the values of today. The second question you asked, and I'm going to answer very quickly because I've sort of already answered it, is should the Brazilian Constitution's Article 60 be changed to include procedures for dismemberment as well as the procedures that exist for amendment? My answer is yes. I think the Constitution should have different procedures to make different kinds of amendments. So easy amendments should be easy to make, right? And then changes to the things that you care a lot about. Maybe the structure of federalism is something you care a lot about. Maybe the commitment to a social state, maybe human rights, whatever it is that you care most about, those should be hard to change, requiring a different threshold of agreement than what you need to change the things that you care less about. But nothing should be made unamendable.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Now, William will read a question of our student, one student. William.
Professor, thank you so much for the reply. Wow, that really gets us thinking what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. So we have selected here a question from Julia Andrade, and she sent two questions. I will read one of them because it was enforced by other colleagues. So democratically, it is the most voted question. She asks, how do you see the practice of approving successive amendments to the constitutions in periods of democratic crisis, and the issue of constitutional replacement under these same conditions?
Great. That's a fabulous question, and I should say that I know Julia. I know Julia Andrade, and in fact, we are working together on a major project, a major global project that is called the International Review of Constitutional Reform. And it's a project that gathers reports from many countries around the world about how their own constitutions have been changed over the past year. And we're going to have maybe 100 reports. I don't know, I'm guessing, maybe 85 to 100 reports from various countries. And Julia is working with me on the project. And you know who else is on the project? We have 5 other colleagues, and I'm one of the co-editors along with Minister Barroso. So Minister Barroso and I are the co-editors, and Julia is one of our associate editors, and Julia is wonderful. So thank you for the question, which is, how do you deal with successive amendments to a constitution in periods of democratic crisis or pressure on democracy? And I think the question is a very good one, because imagine you have a number of amendments to the Constitution that over time incrementally destroy the foundations of the Constitution. So the idea, I think, is instead of making one change to the Constitution that dramatically transforms it, bringing the Constitution from A to Z, I think Julia's question is, what happens if instead of going from A to Z in one move, you instead go from A to B, and then B to C, and then C to D, all the way down to Z in 26 different moves? Because you can achieve the very same effect Julia is asking by making these 26 incremental changes as you can by making the big change in one step. And so Julia is saying, well, okay, you worry about dismemberments, but what about these incremental changes that can achieve the very same effect just over time? And this is a fundamental problem that constitutional design is very ill-equipped to deal with, is this problem that Julia has raised. Because how do you know that when political actors begin their move from A to B and then B to C, that they're eventually hoping to get to Z? You don't know. You don't. You would know if they tried to go from A to Z, but you have no idea what their plans are if they go incrementally from A to B, B to C, C to D. You don't know until it's too late. And so I think what Julia is asking is, what are the mechanisms that are available to help prevent this from happening? And the answer is, it's a very hard problem, because unless you have a court step in and say, well, we think that by going from A to B and B to C and C to D, eventually you're going to try to get to Z. If you have a court step in, it might be that the court is stepping in too early, where there's not enough evidence that really the political actors are trying to make that dramatic transformation to the Constitution to get it to Z. But then if the court steps in when you're already at T or V, it's too late. And so this is a difficult problem for constitutional design. There is one thing that is possible that I think political actors can do when they write constitutions, and I've seen this in constitutions around the world. One design that can help to slow down this process of incremental dismemberment. Some constitutions around the world have a rule that say, once you have passed one amendment, you cannot pass another amendment for at least another year. And so this would be one way of slowing down the process that Julia has pointed to, which is rather than going from A to Z in one big move, a dismemberment, and instead trying to go from A to Z in 26 different steps, you would require someone to wait 26 years, right? Because you have to wait 1 year after every amendment has been passed. So this is one strategy that I've seen happen around the world, but it's not optimal. It's susceptible to criticisms, susceptible to abuse and misuse. So there is no best answer here. But you see, Julia is very bright. She has put her finger on one of the great challenges for constitutional designers around the world today, is how to address that problem, the problem of incremental dismemberment.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Richard. Now, Professor Bruno, if you want to make any comment.
Well, again, I would like to thank you, Richard, for your brilliant lecture. Part of the questions I had, you have already answered, but I'd like to remember that in Brazil, we make about 3 amendments per year since '88, so it's a lot of things. And I always wonder the difficulties of comparing different systems of different countries. Do you have any specific methodology or any recommendation to the persons that are willing to make comparative studies in constitutional law? Because we know the specificities about our history. We know why it's almost self-evident why the vote is an eternity clause here in Brazil. We could derive vote from fundamental rights, but the vote is specifically listed as an eternity clause here in Brazil, since during the dictatorship we didn't have this possibility. We don't have democracy, as you said, but we have the vote. And we have a long history about fraud in the elections and lots of problems. And if you have any advice to the ones that are willing to make comparative studies, if there is a methodology, an author or someone that you would recommend. And since you said, and I agree totally with you about the idea that a constitution is, and we should interpret the constitution as a living constitution, not, I don't like the originalists, but what is your perspective about this wave of the right-wing or extremist right-wing perspectives, especially with the last nomination made by Trump of Amy Barnett into the Supreme Court? And this is about the future or expectations about the Supreme Court with this new structure that is established here, there in the US. And I don't know, because you have you are Canadian, so you have two worlds, views and different realities. Because I think that the Supreme Court from Canada is so interesting. The notwithstanding clause, that there are different examples, and the Supreme Court nowadays is worrying possibly everyone in the world, or at least everyone concerned with this perspective since the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Well, thank you for those questions, Professor Bruno. Great, fun questions, I think, to discuss, but also important questions to discuss. The first question about methodology. So for people interested in engaging in the comparative study of constitutions, what are my thoughts about that? My thoughts are, I think, the ones that you have too, which is that one has to be attentive to the different cultural, sociological, political specificities that underpin the Constitution. Because the Constitution is more than the piece of paper, right? The Constitution is its operation, it's its history, it's how it's understood, it's how or not it's venerated, it's how it's received by the people. And so if one is doing real comparative constitutional studies, one has to be aware that the Constitution can't be understood simply by looking at the text. One has to know the people, one has to know the history, one has to know a lot about the background of the Constitution. So that's my first, I think, piece of advice, is that that's indispensable to really understand a Constitution. Now, in my own field of study, how we changed constitutions, there is a lot of interest in trying to compare amendment difficulty across jurisdictions. People want to know, which is the world's most difficult constitution to amend? Which is the world's easiest constitution to amend? It's a hard question to answer, because most often people will just look to the paper and they'll say, well, okay, this constitution requires 3/4 agreement. this constitution requires 2/3 agreement, so because it requires 3/4, it must be harder to change. They would say, well, the Brazilian constitution requires 3/5. Yes, Article 60. And the New Zealand constitution requires just a simple majority in the unicameral house. Therefore, Brazil is harder to change than New Zealand. That, I think, is too myopic. It's too narrow an understanding of how constitutions change, because they change in ways that don't always align with the rules in the text of the Constitution. And just because a threshold might be high, 3/5, doesn't mean that it's hard. It could be easy. Imagine you have one dominant party in a legislature that has 70% of the seats. Well, if it requires 2/3 agreement in the legislature to propose and amend the Constitution, then it's very easy to do that, right? 2/3 is very low if you have 70% control of the legislature. In contrast, if amending the Constitution requires a simple majority, you might think that's easy. But what if there's no party that has a majority of 50% plus one in the House? And what if it's a coalition government that is an unsteady coalition? Well, there it might be very difficult to get 50% plus one agreement to amend the Constitution. And so we need to know a lot more than just reading the text of the Constitution's amendment rules to try to figure out which of the constitutions of the world is easiest or hardest to amend. And that, I think, goes for any inquiry that we do that is cross-national. We have to know more than just the text. It can't just be that you read the text that's translated into your language, French, English, whatever it is, and then you compare that way. We have to know about the people and the history and the culture, the sociology, and the political configuration of power. And so that, I think, is the best advice that anyone can get if they're hoping to embark in the comparative study of constitutions. Second question that you asked was about the current state of the US Supreme Court. It has undergone a change in its composition. The current president has had 3 new nominees that have been confirmed to the court. And I think it's fair to say that the court is now a more conservative court than it was before, than it has been in quite some time. And I think a lot of people will criticize this for a couple of reasons. One, they'll criticize it from their own normative perspective. They'll say, well, I don't want a conservative court because I have more liberal leaning values, and that's fine. They might also say that the process by which the new conservative majority was created was problematic. The point to remember is that the constitutional court that exists today in the United States, it has been created as a result of a process that invites that kind of a move. It invites this kind of a power play that the president has engaged in. Everyone knows that if you want to get control of the US Constitution, you first have to get control of the presidency, and then you get control of the Senate. And once you have control of the presidency and the Senate, then you do what you want to do, because everyone knows that that is how the Constitution is changed. The Constitution changes at the court. And the battleground for constitutional changes in the US is the Senate confirmation process. In order to have the power to get a nominee before the Senate Judiciary Committee in the Senate, you need to win the White House. And then once you win the White House, you have to win the Senate. You need a majority now of the Senate to do that. Well, the Republican Party has done that. The Republican Party won the White House, controls the Senate, and it has done what it has told everyone that it has sought out to do. No one should be surprised about the current composition of the US Supreme Court. The President of the United States told us that this is what he was going to do when he was a candidate. He said, here's my list of Supreme Court nominees if I become president, and if vacancies arise, I'm going to choose people from this list. And the Senate said, elect more of us Republican senators so that we can control the majority in the Senate. And if you elect us, we will confirm the nominees that the president said that he would nominate. Everyone knew that this would happen, and that's in fact what has happened. And so now, because there's this conservative court in the United States, and because some people believe that that conservative court was achieved in these procedurally irregular ways, there is a backlash. And the backlash may take the form of an effort by the new Democratic president and perhaps a new Democratic Senate. It depends on what happens in January. There are 2 senatorial elections that will be fought in January, and they hold the key to the balance of power in the Senate. And so if the Democratic Party wins the Senate, then there's a possibility that you will have an effort to pack the court, which is to say, to create new seats on the Supreme Court so that the new Democratic president and the new Democratic Senate, if they win the Senate in January, can collaborate in appointing and confirming new judges to the court to create a new Democratic liberal majority. So you see, this is what's happening now in the United States. None of this is a surprise to anyone, because the president said that this is what he would do. The Senate said this is what they would do. And now the Democratic Party is saying that they will pack the court if they win the majority in the Senate. And so this is part of the Constitution's operation here in the United States. We see the interplay between constitutional law and constitutional politics. There's very little difference between the two. Constitutional law and constitutional politics in the United States are really synonymous. And that's why we see what we see now in the current composition of the US Supreme Court.
Thank you, Richard. I would have lots of questions, but I think we have taken up lots of your time. I would like to express my gratitude again. We didn't just remember about Thanksgiving. We just have Black Friday, but we copied these in the market field, but not in the holiday. We don't have the turkey, but thank you again for doing this.
Well, I think any opportunity to say thanks and to express gratitude is one that we should take. And so this is one reason why I very much appreciate the tradition of gratitude that exists in the United States. We also have it in Canada. We have Thanksgiving, but we celebrate it in October. Yeah. And so since I've been living in the United States, I came here for university, I stayed for law school, I've been working here. I've had the pleasure of celebrating Thanksgiving twice, first in October and then in November, because there's a lot to be thankful for. And one of the things I'm thankful for is our friendship and this invitation that you've given me to exchange ideas about important subjects that not only touch upon the future of the Constitution in Brazil, but the future of constitutions around the entire world. And so it's a pleasure, it's a privilege, it's an honor to have the chance to exchange these ideas with you and to be in touch with you and your students and your colleagues. So thank you so very much.
Okay, Richard. So, as Bruno said, I think we are taking too much time from you. And of course, we could stay here for more 2 hours at least. And we have a lot of questions coming from our students, but I think we need to finish, Richard, because in about 10 minutes, 7 p.m. here, the class will begin. And so the students have to go to them. But in the name of the UniBrasil, we, William, Bruno, and I would like to thank you again a lot for being with us here virtually, but it is a great honor and a pleasure to have you here with us. You were very kind with us, and we hope you can be here soon after this pandemic period. Thanks very, very much. We will finish the broadcast in YouTube, then we can talk a little bit more if you want, Richard, with us.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. So just a second. Então, pessoal, muito obrigado, alunos, professores, pela presença hoje aqui em mais esse evento do UniBrasil. Agradeço ao professor Richard de coração por estar aqui conosco, o professor Bruno, que coordenou esse evento, o professor William, que também estava aqui como debatedor, que nos auxiliou também na realização desse evento, todos os nossos alunos aqui da pós-graduação, mestrado e doutorado. Uma boa noite a todos, uma boa tarde, professor Richard, e até o próximo evento.